David Ferriero is our AOTIS Archivist of the United States. He's responsible for the vast holdings of the National Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and also the everyday correspondence of presidents and public servants, everything from memos about Regulation A45 subsection 2 to photographs to, well, let's say maybe tweets from certain office holders that might have been sent today. The National Archives are not just a cool building in Washington, though, either. It's also the presidential libraries and several other facilities across the country under its purview. David Ferriero, welcome to the University of Minnesota.
Honored to be here.
Did you bring a copy of the unredacted Mueller report with you?
I came close to bringing the redacted
Oh, the
copy
redacted
with me,
version.
or at least page 40, which is my favorite page of the report.
So actually on that point, if the unredacted report is never released publicly, is it lost to history, or is there actually a mechanism in place that it will be somewhere in the archive?
There are already 2 copies that I can guarantee you will be available at some point. One in the Trump Presidential Library, and the other in the Department of Justice.
So the fact that it lived in the DOJ means that DOJ means that someday
it is a record, is a federal record, and will become part of the National Archives.
So when you see the news reports about will it or won't it, you just sit back, you're like, hey.
I got enough to worry about.
You became Archivist of the United States in 2009, a year in which I will point out that Twitter was only celebrating its 3rd birthday when you became Archivist. So I think that's a little hint to this question, but how does the job and responsibility, how has that changed in those 10 years?
We are now on 16 platforms, 16 social media platforms. When I was getting ready for my confirmation hearing, I was actually on the train coming from New York to Washington and reading the New York Times and reading an article that the White House was letting an RFP for advice on how to handle their social media records. Mm-hmm. And I'm not the archivist yet, but I'm saying to myself, wait a minute, that's the responsibility of the National Archives. That was my heads up moment to realize that the National Archives was not in the social media space. So this is 2009.
Yeah.
As you said, Twitter was already alive. There are already lots of social media vehicles available that people were using. The role of the National Archives is to advise the White House and the executive branch about the records implications of the technologies that they're using. And if the National Archives isn't using those technologies, how on earth can we be providing that kind of advice? So within the first couple of months on the job, I discovered that there was a group of folks, staff, who were meeting in secret, who were really interested in social media. They weren't allowed to form a committee, so they were meeting in secret. And I caught wind of this and walked into one of their meetings, and they thought they were busted, you know. But we sat down and talked for an hour about the ideas that they had. And I very much wanted to get the staff engaged in experimenting with social media, so authorized them at that point to experiment. So this was early on 2009, or probably early 2010. I authorized them to buy 25 iPads and iPhones to experiment. So the next morning I got a call from my CIO, my then CIO, to say, I understand you want iPhones and iPads. And I said, isn't it exciting? We're going to be experimenting. And she told me, well, you know, we don't support that technology. And the next call I got was from the acquisitions department. I understand you want, yeah, isn't it exciting? We're going to be experimenting. And I was told that it would take 13 months to get that. So that was my introduction to working in the federal government.
Yeah.
and what I was up against in terms of becoming a little more flexible in the technology arena.
In general, though,
Yes.
when you say that you're going to archive, for example, all of the president's tweets, do you print out the tweets and put them in a book? How do you archive? You just brushed me off. Like, how do you used to do it that way? Yeah.
For electronic mail, but no, we captured the electronic version of that. We were very fortunate to have a former president who spent 8 years tweeting, so we got a lot of experience in capturing tweets. It's a little more complicated with this administration because we have the personal account and the official account.
Right.
Real Donald Trump and POTUS, two separate Twitter accounts, and compounded by the fact that they're deleted. So we capture them before the deletion.
And you still have them.
Yeah.
You still have them. So, for example, just on that point, this is where we could go down a bunch of rabbit holes. So, Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, still has his own personal account.
Yeah.
Do you archive
Yeah.
the tweets now that he's no
He's
longer?
not president anymore.
Well, I know that. I just wasn't sure.
Just letting you know.
The Secret Service protection continues. I wasn't sure if the archiving does.
No.
Your big goal here, as you've alluded to, has been really bringing both the National Archives and the federal government into the digital age in a way that you can not just have email and digital records, but to archive it. And that's never the thing we think about in that first meeting. How's it going?
We were very fortunate during the previous administration to capture the attention of the president. The thing that convinced me to move from New York to Washington was the fact that the new administration was serious about an open government initiative, transparency, collaboration, and participation, and they were convinced, the administration was convinced that the National Archives had an important role to play. So I made it, and that was for me, that was the tipping point in coming to Washington. And we were so supported by that administration that the president issued a directive to all of the agencies on memorandum on managing government records in an electronic environment. First time the White House has gotten involved in record keeping since the Truman administration. That authorized me to work with OMB, Office of Management and Budget, to then set out some stakes, some milestones for the federal agencies about ending paper record keeping and migrating to all electronic record keeping, which is the process that we're moving through right now.
So someday the records of an administration will exist only on servers?
So I can tell you for the Obama administration, 90% of those records for that administration are electronic only. No paper equivalent.
No paper. But that's good if I live here in Minnesota. I can just, maybe not today, but in theory someday.
You will.
I'll just find them.
That's right.
They're online.
Exactly. Right. Which you can't do in the other presidential libraries.
Right, you have to go to the library and request those documents. But if I'm two staffers of the Obama White House or even the Trump White House and we're sending emails back to each other about what we want for lunch that day, is that going to be archived?
In the White House, yes. In the federal agency, no. Two sets of laws, Presidential Records Act, Federal Records Act. Presidential Records Act was created after the President Nixon's attempt to claim his own records. So a law was passed to create the Presidential Records Act, which spells out anything that's created in the White House is record. Unlike what happens in the agencies, which are covered by the Federal Records Act, so not everything is saved forever. Only about 2 to 3% record schedules are created. Disposition, how long they need to be kept in the agency, when they get transferred.
We're going through deciding what you save.
Exactly the same kind of record keeping that a university uses, a corporation uses. It's the same routine.
And yet there have been stories, at least one that I saw from over the years, even in the Obama administration, where it was found or believed to have been found that thousands of documents were lost, digital documents. First of all, how do you know?
Yeah, right.
Right?
That's right.
And secondly, is it malicious or just in the normal course of deleting emails, right? Don't we all delete emails?
No, we don't all delete emails. I think what you probably read about was the during the Bush transition.
Yes.
Like 3 million email messages disappeared. And this is just before I got there. And but they found them. So they weren't really lost yet.
So I used to work at...
Unlike what happened with the former Secretary of State and her email.
Right. Do you have anything to say about that?
We're still looking for some of them.
Because those would fall under the Federal Records Act, and so those should be
Those are Federal
archived
Records Act,
for the
yeah.
National Archives.
Yeah.
You know, I used to work at Minnesota Public Radio, a media company that has a very good audio archive. Like all the stories they've done back into the 70s are on tapes and reel reels, and they're digitizing them. But what we've done online, especially those early years, a lot of it's lost. And frankly, every time you update the website, there's new metadata and all that stuff, and a lot of stuff's lost. Is that happening?
Websites are a real problem.
Is that happening at the federal government level?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We have a new set of guidance for the agencies on harvesting websites, but the technology isn't there to capture them in a real-time manner. The work that the Internet Archive is doing out in California is doing snapshots, random snapshots for a selected group of websites. It's not the solution. It's not the solution.
So how much of this transition that you're in to have these digital archives is also about changing the work habits
You think?
of the people, right? I mean, it just seems like the example would be that over the decades, people would have gotten used to saving copies of paper and putting them into files, and every month you put that into the next office or the file cabinet, and then you have to change, right? You have to change that way of living, and now it's all digital.
Right, and the strategy that we're taking is to work with the industry to create the tools that make it easier for people to do that. To take the decision-making, the human decision-making out of the record-keeping, because that's what interferes with getting what we actually need.
So that it's automatic.
Exactly. So when I first started, we were using a tool called FileSurf, which is an electronic mail archiving tool, where in order to send an email message, I had to answer some questions, like, is this a record, and what kind of record, and before I could send it.
For every email.
Yeah. And so guess what you do?
You use your
It's not a record.
Yeah.
You just declare it not a record, so you can send the thing because it was getting in the way. And that's not the way we want to support people who are supposed to be record keeping.
So is it now that even if I'm in the West Wing and I'm asking my colleague for lunch, and we send an email, it's just automatically, like I don't even think about it?
Well, I can tell you just based on my own experience for 10 years reading some of those emails, it's not just, let's go to lunch. It's, let's go to lunch and talk about the draft memo that I just sent you. So it's a combination of personal and business.
Right. And there's no way to distinguish.
And I don't think we should. I don't think we should, because in 100 years, if you want to know how technology was being used and what the communication patterns, social communication patterns were in the White House, you want that information.
What are the stories that tells, though? We hear, John Meacham will do a book about Andrew Jackson and, the men of letters of the day, right? And they find these old written letters and other forms. What's the story that having lunch orders on email will be able to tell in 100 years?
It's not just lunch orders.
I understand, but it's capturing, right? I mean, if you're a man of letter in the 1700s, you don't spend the ink.
Get over it. It's email now.
I am over it. I'm just wondering whether historians will be able to. How do you call that? How do you go through? How do you find the thing you're looking for that tells the right story?
Just like it's a new way of communicating, it's a new way for historians to be doing their research. And that's what's so exciting about what we're doing with the Obama Library,
right,
is creating a whole new model for providing access, but also working with the historical community to think about what does that mean in terms of research. how does one do research in an all-digital archive?
David Ferriero is with us here at the University of Minnesota, the archivist of the United States, and I'm really glad you brought up President Obama's library, which will be in Chicago. And I want to go through this a little bit because you might have actually seen a news story last year with the headline, and this didn't tell that the headline was that the Obama Library was not going to follow previous National Archives protocol. And if you just read the headline, it leaves you with the impression that they're not going to have anything archived, but that's not what happened.
No, that was a New York Times fake news article. I shouldn't say that out loud. It was not a fake news article. It was not, didn't have all the details that it should have had. And in fact, if you go to, and in fact, the foundation, the Obama Foundation, wrote a letter to the New York Times, which is on the Times site, also on our site. We've got an FAQ, archives.gov. If you go to archives.gov, you can read, keep up to date what's going on with the planning for the Obama Center. It gave the impression that the Obamas had decided to keep their records, that they were controlling the records, and that's not at all what we're doing. As it did not, and it didn't make the point that 90% of those records were electronic. So that piece was missing also. So in the conversations with the Obamas about what their presidential entity would be, they opted for, instead of building a physical facility, to take the money that they would have spent on the building and digitize the rest of the collection. So that 5% of the stuff that isn't in paper form now will be, in fact, we're about to announce a contract for that piece of the operation, so that when that library opens, we will be able to provide full online access to all the records as much as we can, given what the confidentiality and stuff around some of the records.
Classification.
Yeah, exactly. Classified content.
But you mentioned the money used for that. You're talking about the money that would have been used for the portion of the building
Physical facility.
that would house the physical records.
Right.
But there's still going to be a museum. There's still photos.
There will be a museum that will be run by the foundation, not by the National Archives. We will loan them artifacts, since there are like probably 200,000 artifacts, gifts of state that are part of the records of that administration. We will loan them for exhibits.
How is what you just described for what will be the Obama Library in practice, day to day, either as a tourist, going to visit that versus going to the Kennedy Library or the Johnson Library? How will that be different for tourists, and then how will it be different for researchers, if at all? Will the experience be different?
For researchers, it will be different because you don't have to go there to do your research. You can do your research from wherever you are. For tourists, it's going to be exactly the same. It'll be more high-tech at that. Each one of the presidential libraries gets more high-tech because of the amount of electronic information. But the museum experience will be similar to the other 13 presidential libraries.
What's your favorite presidential library?
You're not allowed to have a favorite.
They're like your children. They're all your favorite.
Yeah. I grew up in Boston. JFK was my first presidential library. It still, has a soft spot for me.
I don't think a lot of people here in Minnesota might know that the nearest presidential library here is in Iowa, Herbert Hoover.
West Branch, Iowa.
It's actually
Middle
really
of a
nice.
cornfield.
It's not as big as the other ones.
It's so wonderful. Each one of them is really a unique experience. The Ronald Reagan Library, I think, is probably the over the top, built in Simi Valley, overlooking a valley towards an avocado fields. Has a Air Force One and a pavilion attached to it. Has the tavern from Ireland that President Reagan stopped. His family came from. He stopped in that tavern to have a beer. The tavern was for sale, and the foundation bought it and shipped it to California. and now you can have a beer under the wing.
You can get a Guinness.
Yes.
Under Air Force One.
Under Air Force One.
You know, all of this is to say that in addition to what researchers do, in general, we have freedom of information laws in this country, both at the federal level, which you work with the most, and each state is different too for its own state records. How effective are they, and or do they need their own updates when you talk about this digital world? Do freedom of information laws writ large need an overhaul?
I think it's bigger than freedom of information. It has to do with what I would describe as over-classification to begin with, that there's too much information that's deemed secret, which shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. And I think it's easier for the 2,500 original classifiers, the people who are authorized across the executive branch to actually classify. It's easier for them to market classified rather than going through the detail of. So what we need to do, and we have a public declassification information board that advises the president and Congress on issues around classification. They have recommended to the president a two-tier classification system. Just it's either secret or top secret or secret. And to reduce the number of classified documents. So dealing with that should help with the freedom of information thing, but also we have within the National Archives created in 2009 the Office of Government Information Services, which is the FOIA ombudsman. So any member of the public, lots of journalists who are having trouble with an agency getting their FOIA request dealt with can work with my staff on their behalf to intercede, to cut down on the number of legal cases, and also to speed up access to information. So that OGIS group also does training for FOIA officers. Each federal agency has a FOIA officer and a FOIA staff dealing with FOIA requests.
Do you have any role when something is classified and becomes unclassified? Do you have any role that gives you leverage on whether to deem it unclassified, or are you just the cog in the wheel that formally unclassifies it?
I am not a cog. So at the end of 2009, President Obama created the National Declassification Center within the National Archives with a mandate to review about 400 million pages of classified records going back to World War I. And what it did, unfortunately, didn't give me the authority to make that decision. It gave me the opportunity to convene the original classifiers to review their work. And that process, that assignment gave us the opportunity to create a process to streamline review so that we don't get into those backlog situations again. So the directive gave me 3 years to complete that work, which we did, 400,000 pages in 3 years, and we had two criteria: weapons of mass destruction and national security were the only two criteria by which a document could remain classified. We reviewed the 400,000 pages and released 85% of those have gone to the open shelves. They're now available.
Yeah. We live in a world where I think there are people in this room who would worry that facts don't matter anymore. I'm going to choose not to believe you. So what's the point of having archives in this world?
The archives was created, and it was Franklin Roosevelt who signed the legislation that created it, and he was a passionate believer in access to government information, that the American people needed to be able to hold their government accountable and learn from the past. And the only way to do that was to have access to the records.
Speaking of FDR, a few years after that bill was signed, he spoke at the dedication of his own presidential library, and he said this: "To bring together the records of the past and house them in buildings where they will be preserved for the use of men and women in the future, a nation must
believe in three things. It must believe in the past, it must believe in the future, and it must believe
in the capacity of its own people so to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment in creating their own future.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite quotes. Where did you find that?
Probably on the internet somewhere, right? On one of those websites that won't get archived when they update it. Do we live in that world anymore?
We're trying. We're trying. Yeah. It's still, we're still collecting the good stories and the bad stories. It's not like in some other countries where there's a purging of certain kinds of records. We collect the good stories and the bad stories.
What's in this big conversation that we're having today for you? What is the biggest challenge facing the entity responsible for keeping our records in our archives for future generations?
It has to do with the poor state of the information technology infrastructure of our federal government. The technology infrastructure is not where it should be. It's not as robust as it should be. It reminds me very much of the state of universities before the approach to enterprise computing, where every faculty was allowed to go off and build their own thing or buy their own thing, and then come to the library when they didn't know what to do with it anymore. No enterprise approach to technology, and that's the government is just coming into that arena now.
Does that happen free of political arguments over budgets and shutdowns, or does that need congressional approval?
Oh, it's congressional approval, yeah.
Is this a bipartisan area that you're talking about?
Yeah. Yep.
Well, we found one.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, my oversight committee, I had some really tough folks before the Democrats came into power on the House. Darrell Issa was the chair of my oversight committee, and then Jason Chaffetz. They're two bulldogs, but really understood this and got the importance of technology.
How well do or should federal records and each of the 50 states and their records talk to each other or somehow interact? And I don't know if that's a useful use of our time, but does that happen?
We have very close relationships with something called the Council of State Archivists, COSA, and there are a couple of COSA folks in the room. These are the state archivists, and they meet regularly, but I meet with them also once a year. My staff meets with them, so we do a lot of sharing of best practices. We also, within the National Archives, have a small grant-making arm, the National Historical Preservation and Records Commission, which gives grants to local state archives, local historical collections, non-federal government collections to do processing and digitization. COSA, the state archivists, have a stake in those grants also. But each of the states, have a different set of legislation about what's record and what's not record.
Yeah.
Most of them don't have for instance, the governor's records aren't theirs, aren't part of the archives in many states.
They aren't state-owned? They belong to the governor.
Right.
I think that's how it is in Minnesota, because the governor can choose to donate his or her papers to usually the Historical Society. I see some people from the historical. Do I have that right? Do I have? No, they are public? They do come in the state archives. No matter what. So we have state archives, everybody.
Very good.
See, no, thank you for that. Thank you. So we're different. We are different than what he just said. All right. So thank you. We just got an update from the audience here as you were talking about this. As we talked to David Ferriero, the archivist of the United States, 10 years running, just opened a new exhibit at the building in Washington, the National Archives building, about as we march headlong into 100 years since women gained the vote in the United States. What is that exhibit? What are we going to see if we go to Washington and see that?
You're going to see the checkered story of how we got to where we are and who was excluded, who wasn't part of that march in Washington, who had to march at the back of the group, the struggle that still exists for equal citizenship, the fact that African American women, Native American women were excluded in the early days, using original records and documents, film, and interactive media. The goal of the exhibit is to educate especially young women about what they take for granted in terms of what rights they think they have, that they were born with, that their mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers had to fight for, and to leave them with some sense of their responsibilities then going forward. You can leave, as you leave the exhibit, you go in, you have the opportunity to go into a laboratory where we've got, where you are connected to registering to vote in whatever state you're from. So any state that allows online registration, voter registration, you can do that right there at the end of the exhibit.
After you've been inspired by the exhibit. How much of your job is this, and I don't mean this derogatorily, but is the showcase side of the job, where you put together an exhibit to educate people if they're just tourists coming through Washington or presidential libraries, right? How much of the showcase, for lack of a better term, is the job versus literally just being the warehouse, metaphoric sometimes, where someone like a researcher can just come in as needed or when needed? Is the showcase part of the job to educate the masses more important than?
It's not either or.
It's not.
It's not either or. The exhibit program is to educate people about who we are and what we do. We're like the best kept secret in town. Lots of people don't understand that that records are collected and important. And so one of the ways of doing that is having these exhibits all around the country. And it's this balance between the research enterprise and the education. Yeah. The exhibit program is part of our education program.
I believe there was an original copy of the Declaration of Independence that came to Minnesota a few years ago. Would that have been through the National Archives or no? No, he's shaking his head.
We don't loan the Declaration of Independence.
I'm sure it was real. Well, what is the coolest thing?
We get a call about once a week from someone who's found a declaration.
Oh, they have? Yeah. Well, that's good to know. What's the coolest, you said it's the best kept secret. What's the coolest thing in the National Archives that people don't know is there?
4 letters that a kid from Beverly, Massachusetts wrote to President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and President Johnson.
You? You wrote those? So did you go find them on your first day on the job?
No, it's really funny. When I had my first meeting with the director of the presidential libraries, they went around the room and introduced themselves, and the director of the Kennedy handed me a copy of a letter that a kid wrote to the president asking him for information about the proposed Peace Corps, and it was a letter from me.
Did you get an answer?
No. Nope.
So you didn't join the Peace Corps?
Nope. It was a stunning moment because I remembered being interested in the Peace Corps, but I had forgotten, writing that letter. But more stunning was watching the faces of the other 12 directors, because they were, oh my God, how am I going to top this? So sure enough, 2 weeks later, the Eisenhower called that they found 2 letters from me to President Eisenhower. And then when I was at the LBJ, they handed me this copy of a letter that I wrote to him congratulating him for signing the Civil Rights Act.
What did you write Eisenhower about?
I wanted a picture suitable for framing.
Did you get it?
Yeah.
You got a picture?
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyone who writes a letter
That's correspondence.
That's
Those
correspondence.
are records. Yeah.
If I am part of some advocacy group and they send an email that says, click here to send a letter to the president or send a letter to the speaker to say do this or do that, those are in there too?
Yep. Yep.
The Nixon tapes are in the National Archives?
Yep.
Kennedy assassination records? Area 51, what can you tell me?
No comment. But I can tell you, I told you that the President Obama created the National Declassification Center, and it was important for us to figure out if we're going to get serious about going through this backlog, what's most important? What are people looking for? So I hosted 2 public meetings in Washington for people to come and talk to us about what's most important in terms of establishing priorities in this backlog. And I hosted each of these meetings, and they were exactly the same meeting, and the room evenly split between the Kennedy assassination conspiracy and UFOs.
Really? Because hasn't there been? There's been declassification of UFO stuff and the
a year after that, so which is probably about 3 years ago now, an Air Force top secret report was declassified. Sometime in the 50s, we contracted with a Canadian firm to build a flying saucer.
To proactively.
So we have this secret document that we declassified. It has the schematics, the plan for it, and the report of its test voyage. And so during its $10 million, this thing cost, and during its maiden voyage, it rose 4 feet off the ground and crashed.
Or so you would have us believe.
Yeah.
Why do we have a copy of the Magna Carta in the National Archives? Shouldn't the British Library have that?
They have two.
So we have one just...
We actually have the 1297 version, the only one that was ever implemented.
Why?
And, well, when you live across the street from David Rubenstein, and he owns it, it actually belonged to Ross Perot, so it was in a British family forever. And sometime in the late 90s, the family decided that they needed the money, and they sold it. Ross Perot bought it and deposited it at the National Archives, and then decided, he bought it for like $1.3 million. And at some point decided, early 2000, sometime, that he wanted the money. So he gave it to Sotheby's to sell. David Rubenstein was on a plane coming back to Washington from somewhere and going through his mail and discovered that it was being auctioned at Sotheby's, and so he was concerned about it leaving the United States because the Declaration of Independence, the language, much of the language comes from Magna Carta. So David, next day, flew to New York, never been to an auction before, walked in. It was estimated to go for somewhere between $30 and $45 million. And David got it for $23 million. And
fire sale there at Sotheby's.
And brought it back to the National Archives, paid for its encasement. It's encased exactly the way the Declaration of Independence is.
So that's a personal donation?
Yeah.
I would suspect that's a vast, vast minority of the collection is personal donations. Or maybe I'm not, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right.
What would you want? What do you want from my collection?
That's
home?
what,
what for all the people here in the room? Like,
know,
maybe I've got something.
People often ask me that, and I don't mean to be rude or flip, but I have enough stuff. You heard the figures. We have a lot of stuff.
Final question, and then I'm going to open it up to. I have one more question here, and then I'm going to open it. So if you have a question, get ready to raise your hand, and we have some people with some microphones. We need the microphone, obviously, so everyone can hear it. So get your questions ready. There's a Librarian of Congress and an Archivist of the United States. What's the difference?
One is an African-American woman.
And the other is a Vietnam veteran.
That's right. The library, there's a lot of confusion about the National Archives. A lot of people think it's one of the Smithsonian's or that it's an arm of the Library of Congress, and it's not. The National Archives is responsible for government records, anything created by the federal government. The Library of Congress is everything else. They got an earlier start than the National Archives, so that some of the early stuff which might come to the National Archives is at the Library of Congress. Oh, here's a good story.
Yeah.
The National Archives opened its doors in 1934. It was designed by John Russell Pope. The rotunda was developed specifically to hold the Charters for Freedom. A tabernacle was created to hold the Declaration of Independence. The charters were, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were at the Library of Congress at that point, and the Librarian of Congress refused to give them up. So it wasn't until Harry Truman, 1952.
That you didn't get them.
It didn't come until 1952.
What do? Call up the Librarian of Congress and say, do it?
No, the librarian died, and it was a new librarian.
So we waited them out.
So in great pomp and circumstance, the military procession lined Constitution Avenue, tanks and military vehicles. They brought the charters up the steps into the rotunda. And Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, is still bitter about it. And she told me recently in public, and you sent tanks up to take them.
Do we have the technology, assuming the technology will keep getting better, to keep those original parchments safe for 300 more years?
We hope so. We hope so. We are using state-of-the-art technology. We monitor them constantly. They are encased in, the best possible. But it's something that we want to make sure we're paying attention to.
Is there any protocol that would allow, I don't know what the right term is, but for touch-ups?
Well, it's interesting. William Barton Rogers was the president of MIT, and when he left the presidency, he became the chair of a commission to investigate the state of deterioration of the Declaration of Independence. And this was all triggered by some ink salesman in Philadelphia who had this cunning plan to retouch the Declaration of Independence. So they formed the Congressional Commission to investigate, and they decided not to touch it, leave it alone.
Could we touch it up at some point?
No.
I'm just wondering. I don't know.
No, you have to stabilize it. So we have, Samuel Johnson decided that he wanted to have copies made of it, and so he hired Mr. Stone to do a copper plate. And they made a copper plate, and we have a copy of the original on parchment from that copper plate. Another gift of David Rubenstein. David has 3 of those. He's quite a collector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a question. So we have a microphone coming. So this gentleman, stand up and wait for the microphone, and then introduce yourself and go for your question.
Hi, I'm Steve Lick, a devoted fan of yours. I'm wondering if you could tell us a story that would illustrate why it's important to keep the actual physical objects beyond just them being a talisman or a magical object. I'm thinking with the advance in technologies, are there things that we learn now and we only could have learned because we have these physical objects? Kind of like if the Trout of Turin was analyzed by modern, could you give us an example?
Well, for textual material, I've always been fascinated by the ability to see actually the original strike through and reworking of language. The FDR's speech on the Day of Infamy is a good example. That infamy was originally history, or this day in history, rather than infamy. So
he crossed it out and wrote infamy.
Yeah. So being able to see that creative process and it's the same in literature, and anyone who has a manuscript collection, pays attention to that kind of thing. Something that's lost in the electronic world usually, because versions aren't necessarily kept, and you don't have that same kind of experience. So,
yeah. Over here. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I was terrified to hear you say that all of the Obama records are going to be digitized. Anybody that has a 5 1/4-inch floppy disk sitting someplace that can no longer be read recognizes that there are things called bit rot and other kinds of technological obsolescence. Is there any attempt to think about the backward compatibility issues that are going to be attendant on trying to keep digital records going forward? We can read a piece of vellum from the 1500s. We can't look at a disk from 10 years ago.
yeah, it's something that we are concerned about, and building systems to ensure that we can migrate that content over into new technologies as they're created. As I said, 90% of those records were born digital. There is no paper equivalent.
Are you, do you have like a room with like floppy disk readers in case someone, like the old technology, like radio stations have old real players?
No, we've actually been migrating the content. We're not saving formats. Formats,
No, I understand, you're
It's
right.
the content.
You got to get the stuff off.
exactly, and that's what we're focused on. And we're not alone in this. Large university libraries have the same kind of issue. Our international partners have the same kind of issue. There are a lot of people who are working on this.
Okay, over here, go ahead. Yep.
Pete McGee, is there any possibility that some cataclysmic event could damage a lot of energy sources in the United States and cause a lot of loss of these documents that are saved electronically?
So we are storing in the cloud, which is replicated in several different places. So that's our strategy. All within the continental United States, but it is possible.
That'll be a bad day for you.
Yes,
if that were to happen.
It'll be very
But
bad.
you're confident in the fail-safes and the safeguards that you have and the backups that you have. And I don't understand
Yes.
all the technology,
Yes.
obviously, but you feel confident
Yep.
in that.
Hi. Some local governments, in particular in Minnesota, have a deliberate policy of deleting all of their emails within 6 months or a year or 2 years. How frequently and with what rigor does the archives gather up all of the electronic records that it's responsible for?
So as I said, the way the process works is that record schedules are created, and this is a cooperative process between my records appraisal staff and the records management staff in each agency. So the record schedule describes the kind of records that are created, how long they need to be kept in the agency for business purposes, what 2 to 3% of those records are of legal or historic value that need to get transferred to the National Archives for permanent retention, and the point at which, how many years do they stay in the agency before they're transferred. So those are the schedules that are created, regardless of format. That works for paper, photos, and electronic mail. The same kind of schedule is used.
Which is different in the West Wing versus the agencies, as you noted.
Say that
Because
again?
different in the West Wing
Yes.
versus the agencies.
Yeah, right.
But who makes the determination on those 2 to 3%? Of course,
It's a joint process between my records appraisal folks and the records manager of the agency. And these are, record schedules are reviewed every 5 years.
We have, I'm not.
Hello?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, go ahead.
I can't stand up easily. Considering this wonderful world we're in of fake news and fake stories and fake records, do you ever have a way of validating that you are storing fake versus real?
Do you ever worry? The question was whether in the era of fake, whatever, fake news and records, is it possible that we're just going to get some fake stuff that gets
It is
through?
possible, sure, it's
In the
possible,
archives.
but that's not different today than it was, 50 years ago. Whether the veracity of the information, it's more complicated now because of, how easy it is to manipulate information. I agree. One of the contributing issues is that the Federal Records Act gives me a lot of authority about investigating, monitoring agency record-keeping practices. So I have more, I can send my staff into agencies to do investigations and assessments, which I don't have the same authority in the Presidential Records Act. The Presidential Records Act gives me the opportunity to provide guidance to the White House. So we don't actually know until the end of the administration what we've got. And every time I pick up the newspaper and read some allegation that something is screwy in terms of record keeping, whether it's in a federal agency or in the White House, my staff is on the case with legal counsel in either the White House or the agency. So if you go to archives.gov and you go to our FOIA reading room, you'll see extensive correspondence that we have with agencies or the White House around record keeping.
How do you know at the end of the term if something's lost?
You don't know.
Well, that's a bugger, isn't it? I mean, yeah, I'm just trying to think through whether there's any digital footprint that I don't know enough about that, but to even, you don't know what you don't know, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
Is there an argument to change the way we think about that, since it seems to be based at least partly on trust?
How?
I don't know. You're the archivist, but I mean, no, I get why you asked that. That it's how do you prove how do you prove a negative?
How do you change human behavior?
Yeah. Another question over here. Yeah, she's coming right behind you. So. We need the mic on so that we can archive this.
Yes, I'm curious, with agencies using social media,
Yeah.
are you coordinating or consulting? Since those are private applications, right? Are you consulting
They're
at
not
all
private.
with those?
They're not private. Those are government accounts.
Thank
But
you.
even though it's a third party, I mean, so for example, the Department of Interior has an awesome social media because all they do is show awesome photos of national parks.
Yeah.
So that's a fun one.
It is.
But you archive those,
Yeah,
all those photos.
yeah, yeah.
All right, in the back here, we have about 2 more questions here, so go ahead, sir.
Oh, yeah, Tim Johnson from the University Libraries. Our late Senator Paul Wellstone made provision for transferring his records to the Historical Society about 6 months into his term as senator. One of your roles is on the advisory committee to the records of on the records of Congress. And I'm just wondering what the current state of affairs is in terms of member records.
Members, those records belong to the member. They're not government records. They're personal records of the member. And the most successful arrangements are those that are made with universities, when a member decides to deposit their collection, in either their alma mater or some other university in their state, because they get the best kind of treatment. There are a fair number of, too many, I think, who leave office with their stuff and don't know what to do with it. The clerk of the House and the secretary of the Senate have staffs that provide guidance to the House members and Senate members when they're arriving, to educate them about record keeping and what belongs to Congress and what belongs to them, but also when they're leaving, helping them make decisions about where to place their materials. But as I said, based on my experience, the best arrangements are the ones with a university.
So remember that if you run for office and put them in the university. Final question, do we have anywhere?
Can I?
Oh yeah, final question and then.
So, day 5 of your job, you start this job, and you realize, I can look at anything I want. What did you want to see?
Lots of stuff, but one of the things that I was really interested in was Duke University has a fantastic Walt Whitman collection. New York Public has a wonderful Walt Whitman collection. I knew that Walt Whitman worked in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, so he was a government employee. We have the records of anyone who ever worked in the government. I asked to see Walt Whitman's personnel record. And in it is a wonderful letter of recommendation. He was applying for another job, written by Ralph Waldo Emerson.
David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, thank you so much for being here. Thank you. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.